The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets of Briarwood, a small, affluent suburb just outside of Chicago. Ruth Evans stood in her garden, hands buried deep in the soil, tending to her meticulously arranged flower beds. The quiet serenity of the moment contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside her. It had been nearly a year since she left Tyler, her once loving husband who had turned bitterly cold. Now, as she mulled over her upcoming divorce hearing, Ruth thought back to the promises that had crumbled like the dying leaves at her feet. Tyler had seemed like a man of stability and warmth when they first met, a successful businessman with a charming smile. But after their wedding, his demeanor shifted. He grew distant, controlling the finances with a tight grip, denying her access to basic necessities. The final blow came at her father's funeral, when Tyler had refused to even send a wreath, arriving late and offering nothing but a cold shoulder. Her gaze drifted toward her mother's house across the street, a comforting presence amidst the turmoil. Ruth had kept her head down, quietly building her cooking blog in the late hours of the night, channeling her creativity and frustration into something she could control. Her fingers danced across her laptop, creating new recipes that resonated with an audience she never expected to grow. It wasn't long before a major publisher offered her a cookbook deal, and the inheritance from her grandfather, the 3 high-rise apartments in downtown Chicago, solidified her independence. Tyler and his son, Brett, had no idea of her success. As Ruth wiped the dirt from her hands and walked inside, the sound of her phone ringing startled her from her thoughts. It was her lawyer, calling to finalize details for the divorce hearing the following week. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for what was to come. The facade of her former life was about to shatter completely, and she had no intention of letting Tyler or Brett pick up the pieces. Tyler sat in his once grand office, now cluttered with files and unpaid bills. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. Losing his job had been a public humiliation, and his mistress leaving him shortly after felt like the final insult. He had been a man of status, but now, whispers circulated about his fall from grace. Worse still, Ruth had walked out on him, and he couldn't quite believe how quickly everything had unraveled. Brett, his 23-year-old son, slumped on the couch in the next room. He had dropped out of university after failing most of his courses and was now buried under a mountain of debt, relying on his father for support. But Tyler had nothing left to give. Brett's entitlement and arrogance mirrored his own, but Tyler couldn't afford to see that just yet. All he could think about was how Ruth had seemingly moved on, leaving him to rot in the mess she left behind, or so he convinced himself. When Tyler heard from an old friend that Ruth had been spotted at a posh restaurant in downtown Chicago, the wheels in his mind began to turn. She couldn't have that kind of money, not on her own. It wasn't possible. Unless she had been hiding something. Tyler's ego flared with resentment, and he decided it was time to confront her, to reclaim what was rightfully his. Ruth's mother, Eleanor, was a woman of sharp wit and quiet strength. She had watched her daughter endure years of Tyler's manipulation, biting her tongue for the sake of Ruth's happiness. But that chapter was over now. As Eleanor stood in her living room, staring at the picture of her late husband, the ache of his absence blended with the simmering anger she felt toward Tyler and his son. When Tyler and Brett came knocking one late afternoon, trying to worm their way back into Ruth's life, Eleanor wasn't having any of it. They swaggered in with their usual air of entitlement, their arrogance unmistakable. Brett, now broke and aimless, demanded to speak to Ruth, while Tyler tried to feign concern, asking where she had been and why she wasn't returning his calls. "You have no business being here," Eleanor said, her voice steady but firm. "After everything you did to her, after everything you've taken, you think you can come back and ask for more?" Tyler sneered, but Brett's eyes flickered with discomfort. "We just want to talk, Eleanor. Things got out of hand, but we can make it right," Tyler said, attempting to regain his usual charm. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Ruth doesn't owe you a thing. And if you think for a second that I'm going to let you manipulate her again, you're sorely mistaken. Now get out before I call the police." Tyler's face hardened, but he knew better than to push Eleanor. With a final sneer, he motioned for Brett to follow, leaving Eleanor standing tall, the echo of the door slamming behind them. She immediately called Ruth, her anger mixing with pride as she told her daughter about the encounter. Ruth listened quietly, her heart racing. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning of the divorce hearing arrived, and Ruth stood in front of the courthouse, the weight of the past pressing on her chest. Her lawyer reassured her, but she knew this day wasn't just about the legal proceedings. It was about reclaiming her voice, her freedom, and everything she had kept hidden for so long. Inside the courtroom, Tyler and Brett sat across from her, their eyes filled with disdain. Tyler's lawyer began with a smug smile, talking about community property and what Tyler was entitled to. Ruth felt a pang of anger rise in her chest, but she stayed calm. She had been preparing for this. When it was her turn to speak, Ruth's voice didn't waver. She revealed the truth, about the financial abuse, the emotional manipulation, and the years of control Tyler had exerted over her. She detailed how he had kept her under his thumb, refusing to even pay for a wreath at her father's funeral. Then, with quiet satisfaction, she explained her success, her blog, her cookbook deal, and the apartment she had inherited from her grandfather. Tyler's face paled as the reality of Ruth's independence sank in. Brett shifted uncomfortably, his father's illusion of control crumbling before him. For the first time, Tyler was speechless. Ruth had won, not just the divorce, but her freedom. The weeks following the court decision were harsh for Tyler and Brett. Tyler's reputation, already in shambles, took a final blow when word of the divorce settlement leaked. His once glamorous lifestyle vanished, leaving him ostracized and broke. Brett, without his father's support and facing mounting debts, spiraled further, grasping at straws for a way out. But their desperation led them down a darker path. Tyler and Brett's desperation turned into a simmering obsession. Cut off from Ruth's newfound wealth, they began plotting to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Tyler's arrogance, once fueled by his success, was now driven by rage and humiliation. Brett, who had always followed in his father's shadow, saw no future for himself without Ruth's money. Together, they hatched a plan as reckless as it was vengeful. Late one evening, Tyler and Brett decided to confront Ruth directly at her apartment in the city. Armed with their anger and the belief that they could intimidate her into giving them money, they drove in silence, their minds consumed with what they were about to do. Tyler had convinced himself that Ruth owed him. Brett, fueled by his father's bitterness and his own failures, was more than willing to help. But Ruth wasn't the same woman they had once controlled. She had spent months building a life of her own, free from their toxic influence. The cooking blog that had once been her secret was now a well-known site, with followers who eagerly awaited her recipes and upcoming book launch. She had regained her confidence, and she wasn't going to let them drag her back into the past. When Tyler and Brett arrived at her upscale high-rise apartment building, they were surprised to find security measures in place that hadn't existed when Ruth first moved in. The concierge desk, the surveillance cameras, it all spoke of the life Ruth had built, independent and secure. Tyler's jaw tightened as they entered the lobby, their confidence beginning to erode as they realized they were no longer in control. Upstairs, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, finishing edits on her cookbook manuscript. A quiet evening, filled with the scent of rosemary from the dish she had prepared earlier, was suddenly interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. She froze for a moment, the sound unsettling, but when she glanced through the peephole and saw Tyler's face, a wave of anxiety rushed through her. Brett stood beside him, his eyes shadowed by desperation. She hesitated but knew she had to face them. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door just enough to look them in the eye. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Tyler sneered, leaning into the doorframe as if to assert dominance. "You know exactly what we want, Ruth. You think you can just walk away from everything we built together and leave us in the dirt? You owe us." "I owe you nothing," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the tension rising in her chest. "I've already given you more than you ever deserved." Brett, jittery and agitated, took a step forward. You think you're better than us now, don't you? Just because you've got a fancy apartment and some book deal? We're not leaving here until you give us what's ours. Ruth's heart raced, but she didn't back down. What's yours? You've taken everything from me already. I rebuilt my life without you. And I'm not afraid of you anymore. Tyler's face contorted with fury. You think you're safe behind your lawyers in this building? You don't know how deep I can cut, Ruth. You'll regret this. Before things could escalate further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from down the hallway. Ruth had called the building's security the moment she saw Tyler and Brett on her doorstep. 2 uniformed guards appeared, their presence a stark reminder that Tyler and Brett's intimidation tactics no longer had any power here. Is there a problem here, ma'am? One of the guards asked, stepping between Ruth and her ex-husband. Ruth exhaled slowly, her eyes locking with Tyler's. No problem, she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. These men were just leaving. Tyler's face darkened, but he knew there was nothing more he could do. Without another word, he turned on his heel, Brett reluctantly following behind him. As they left, the tension in the air slowly dissipated, and Ruth closed the door, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. But she had won, again. She wasn't that frightened, broken woman anymore. In the weeks that followed, Ruth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She threw herself into her work, preparing for the launch of her cookbook while continuing to care for her mother, Eleanor, who had been her greatest support through the ordeal with Tyler and Brett. The book deal had opened doors Ruth never thought possible: television appearances, magazine features, even offers for a cooking show. She was thriving in every sense. But in the shadows, Tyler and Brett had not given up. The humiliation of being thrown out of Ruth's apartment by security festered in Tyler's mind. His life was in ruins, no job, no money, and now, no pride. He began drinking heavily, spiraling deeper into his bitterness. Meanwhile, Brett, consumed by his own failures, began blaming his father for everything. The once strong bond between them, built on shared arrogance and entitlement, started to fray. One night, after a particularly heated argument between father and son, Tyler disappeared. Brett, angry and confused, called his father repeatedly but got no answer. Days passed, and still no word. Ruth, oblivious to their continued plotting, carried on with her life. But something felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. One evening, as Ruth returned home from a meeting with her publisher, she noticed a car parked across the street from her apartment building. The same car she had seen the night before. Her pulse quickened, but she brushed it off as paranoia. Still, the sense of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't until a week later, when she found an envelope slipped under her door, that she realized her instincts had been right. Inside was a note, written in Tyler's unmistakable handwriting: "This isn't over." Ruth's blood ran cold as she stared at the note in her hand. Tyler's threat loomed over her, a dark reminder that he wasn't done with his twisted games. She immediately called the police, handing over the note as evidence. They assured her they would investigate, but Ruth knew Tyler was smart. He had always been careful not to leave any obvious trails. The following days were filled with an uneasy tension. Ruth continued with her book tour, balancing her growing success with the constant fear that Tyler might show up at any moment. She installed extra security in her apartment and hired a private investigator to keep an eye on Tyler and Brett, but they seemed to have vanished. As the weeks passed, the fear began to subside. Ruth's book launch was a success, and she found solace in her growing community of supporters. But just as she started to believe she was finally free, the investigator called with unsettling news: Tyler's body had been found in a remote part of the city. It appeared he had died in a car accident, his vehicle skidding off the road late at night. Ruth felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sorrow, and guilt. Tyler's death meant the end of his threats, but it also meant closure in a way she hadn't anticipated. Brett, devastated by his father's death and drowning in his own failures, left town shortly after, disappearing into the anonymity of a city that no longer cared about his name. Months later, as spring bloomed in the city, Ruth stood on the balcony of one of her inherited apartments, looking out at the skyline. The past year had been a whirlwind: divorce, confrontation, fear, and finally, the closure she needed. Tyler was gone, Brett was out of her life, and she was free to live without the weight of their manipulation. Her cookbook was now a bestseller, and she had found a deeper sense of purpose in her work. But more than that, she had found peace within herself. Ruth had learned to trust again, not just others, but her own instincts and strength. She had rebuilt her life, stronger and more resilient than before, and she knew that no matter what the future held, she could face it. With her mother by her side and her career flourishing, Ruth finally felt a sense of redemption. The lies, betrayals, and treachery that had once haunted her were now nothing more than memories. And as she stood there, the sun setting on the horizon, she smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning of her new life. The threads of her past had unraveled, but Ruth had woven them into something stronger, something that no one could ever take away from her again. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.